In May 1973, the whole world watched the United States launch Skylab, America's first space station, a triumph on every front page. 3 days earlier, the Soviet Union had already put a space station in orbit. You've never heard of it? Because they erased it. Not blown up, not lost to a rocket failure. They let it reach orbit, watched it die within hours, then filed it away under a dull catalog number, Cosmos 55V7, and let it disappear from history. But the records, the flight diary of the program's own chief designer, the memoirs of the man who ran their mission control, and the tracking logs of the US military that watched the whole thing, tell a stranger story. A brand new space station that, within hours of reaching orbit, was tricked into destroying itself. No myth, just what the records actually show. It was called DOS-3, the third in the Soviet Union's civilian space station line, the same program that had built Salyut 1 2 years earlier. Had it worked, you'd know it by a different name. It was meant to fly as Salyut 3, the Soviet answer to Skylab, and the Soviets wanted it up first. So on the 11th of May, 1973, a Proton rocket carried 19 tons of space station off the pad at Baikonur 3 days before Skylab, and it reached orbit. A low one, about 220 kilometers up, but orbit. The plan was simple from there: stabilize, raise to its working altitude, and wait for a crew already training to come aboard. That crew never launched. There is no Salyut 3 in the history books. The next station to carry that name was a different machine entirely. So what happened in the hours after it reached orbit? To point itself in space, a station needs to know which way it's facing. DOS-3 carried a brand new device to do that, an ion flow orientation sensor. The idea is elegant. High above the Earth, the thin upper atmosphere is a faint stream of charged particles, ions, flowing past the station as it races around the planet. Read the direction of that flow and you know your orientation. No stars to track, no gyros to drift. The older stations used 2 separate sensors, one for each axis. To save weight and complexity, DOS-3's new unit did both axes through a single opening. And here is the flaw that ground testing missed, a flaw that, in orbit, would turn the station against itself. Because there was one thing already known from earlier Soyuz flights. A spacecraft's own thruster exhaust can disturb that delicate ion stream. The engineers knew it. They just badly underestimated how much. Here is what the records show. And to be clear, this account comes from one place: the flight diary of chief designer Vasily Mishin and the memoirs of engineer Boris Chertok, pieced together by the historian Anatoly Zak. The Soviet state never published it. When the station's automatic system tried to orient itself, it fired its attitude thrusters. The exhaust from those thrusters disturbed the ion stream, exactly as feared. But because the new sensor read both axes through one aperture, that interference didn't corrupt one reading. It corrupted 2 at once. The flight computer did nothing wrong. It read the sensor, saw the station was pointing the wrong way, and fired the engines to correct it, obeying perfectly data that was a lie. And the engine's exhaust disturbed the sensor more, which produced worse data, which fired the engines harder, a closed loop. The station, by Mishin's record, was rotating 10 times faster than anyone had predicted. Chertok described it best: the station was chasing its own tail, except it was doing it along 2 axes at once. Every correction made it worse, and every correction burned fuel. The station's attitude system ran on liquid propellant, a fuel and an oxidizer, burned together in small thrusters. By the second orbit, the pressure in the fuel tank had already started to fall. By the third orbit, roughly 8 hours after launch, the fuel was effectively gone. Not all of it. The oxidizer remained, only the fuel had run dry. But a thruster needs both. With nothing left to fire, the station could no longer stop its own spin. It tumbled, helpless, in the wrong orbit, leaking the last of its control. The cosmonauts waiting to fly to it were stood down. Their station was a 19-ton derelict 8 hours into its life, and no one would ever set foot inside it. And the cruelest detail in the record is this: it didn't have to die. There was a backup. A second low-thrust orientation mode using infrared sensors instead of the ion unit, a gentler system that, by the engineer's own later analysis, would likely have used little enough fuel to ride out the problem. But switching to it was a decision that had to be made on the ground, fast, by a team reading fragmentary telemetry from a tumbling station in the dark. By the time the call could have been made, the station was already spinning too hard and the fuel was already gone. The Soviet post-mortem didn't blame a single broken part. It blamed two things: a new sensor pushed into flight without enough testing, and ground procedures too slow to catch the failure in time. This wasn't an unstoppable death spiral. It was a machine doing exactly what it was told, by people who were a few hours too slow to tell it otherwise. So now the Soviets had a problem. Not how to save the station, that was over. How to make it disappear. You cannot hide a 19-ton object in low orbit. The US military had been tracking it since launch. It was logged, numbered, catalogued. Within days, its orbital data was printed in the Washington Post and Aviation Week, and Western analysts were openly arguing about whether the Soviets had just lost a Salyut. So the Soviets didn't hide the object. They hid the story. They gave the dead station the most forgettable name they had: Cosmos 55V7. And here's the part the dramatic retellings get wrong. That wasn't a clever fake name invented to fool anyone. Cosmos was a generic label the Soviets had been slapping on satellites since 1962. Hundreds of them, a catch-all for failures, test articles, and anything classified. The same bin that would later hold a stranded Venus probe. That was the genius of it. A space station that should have been a triumph became just another anonymous Cosmos, a line in a catalogue, a number that invited no questions. They couldn't conceal that it existed. They concealed that it mattered. 11 days after launch, on the 22nd of May, 1973, Cosmos 55V7 re-entered the atmosphere and burned up, a station no one was ever allowed to mourn. A year and a half later, the Soviets flew an almost identical station. The sensor fixed, the procedures tightened. It worked perfectly. They called it Salyut 4. It is remembered. The one that came first is not. The first casualty of the space station race wasn't a cosmonaut. It was a machine that was talked into destroying itself by its own exhaust, and then quietly deleted from the record behind a number. That's not the story the Soviet Union told. It's the one their own engineers wrote down. There's another Soviet space secret the records tell completely differently. That one's next.